Now that our tables are created, let's set up our roots, our model for our links table, and also our link controller, and we'll just define the methods that we're going to use here. So inside of roots, we're going to need two additional roots. We'll need one, which is a post route, so we'll be sending post data through to this, and that's make. This is going to make a short URL. So in here we pass an array, and we need to give this an alias. I'm going to call this make, and we're going to use the link controller, and we're going to use the method make. We'll be creating this link controller in a minute. It currently doesn't exist. So we also need another route, which is get. You may have guessed this is to get a short URL by a code. So when we copy and paste this to share it with someone, this will then get the code, find the URL associated with it, and it will go ahead and redirect. So I'm just going to put a placeholder in there for a variable. In this case, it's a code, and we'll be passing that through to our link controller. We're going to call this get as its alias, and we'll say that uses, and we'll use the link controller, but this time we'll use the get method within there. So let's create our link controller. So inside of controllers, we create a new file, and we define a class called link controller, and we extend the base controller. So let's save this as link controller.php. We need to define what fillable fields we have in here. So we know that we want to, using Laravel's functionality. Oh, sorry, we don't. We need to do that in the model. So for this one, we need to define the methods. My mistake. So public function make, as we've already seen, we want to make a URL with this, and we also want get as well. Now with get, this requires a code. As you saw, we passed this through as the placeholder here, and there it is. So we'll leave these alone for now, and we'll create our model, which I was mistakenly talking about a moment ago. So we're going to call this link.php. So it's just basically links, but a singular version. And this is how Laravel's Eloquent ORM deals with pluralization in tables. You can call this whatever you want as long as you specify which table you're referring to. But we're not going to be doing that here because links and link make sense. So this is going to be a class of link, and it's going to extend Eloquent. And that means that we can use things like the create method, the update method, the where method, all the useful functionality. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to define which fields here are fillable. In this case, it's a comma-separated array of fields. So we want the URL to be fillable, and we want the code to be fillable. And that's it. So that's all we need to do in this model. So we've now got our MVC structure set up. So we've got our roots, which pass through to our link controller. And inside of the link controller, we're going to make use of the link model. So let's start to test these out. So inside of link controller, let's echo out input get URL. So we're using the input helper here, and inside of home.blade.php, remember earlier we didn't fill this action in, and that's because we didn't have an action to go through to. This would have errored. Inside of roots now though, we have a route to make the URL, and this is called make. So we can say URL action make. So when we enter a URL here, you can see that will go through to make, and we've already output the contents of this URL within the input. So we see we get whatever we typed in here. So now that we've done that, that's useful. We know that we can start to do whatever we need to do inside of the link controller. So let's start to build up this make method. The first thing that we want to do is validate. We want to make sure that this URL value exists, and we also want to make sure it's a URL. We could go as far as actually defining that it's a maximum of 255 characters as defined in our schema. So let's do this now. We create a new variable called validator, and we use the validator make method. Now this takes two parameters. The first one is the input. In this case, it's all of the input. The second is an array with key value pairs. The key here is going to be the name of the field, i.e. URL. So we can say URL. Now we define the properties that help validate this. So we want this to be required, and we want this to be a URL, and we want this to be a maximum of 255. Obviously, depending on your needs or whatever, you can change this. So we now use the fails method to check if the validation has failed. So we say validator fails. If it does fail, we want to redirect back to the index page with the errors and display them. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and actually generate everything as normal. So in here, we return and we do a redirect back to the home action that was defined in our routes file here, so as home. And we want to send this back with input, so we can output this inside of a value attribute in the input field. And we also want to send back errors, and we use the validator in here to define which errors, because you may have multiple validator instances. Now otherwise, I'm just going to echo OK here just to signify that this works. We'll test this out in just a moment. So now we need to create an if statement down here to actually check whether there are any errors. So let's create an if statement with the blade syntax, and we'll also end that. So we use this errors variable that's now available to us as we pass this back to this on the redirect. So we check if the URL is contained within these errors. Now if it is, we want to generate a paragraph, and we want to output something, and that is errors first. So this will just get the first error, so the user will have to keep correcting themselves, and this will be URL. So now what we also want to do is inside of this input here at the end, we also want to check if input old exists for the URL. So we create a ternary operator and we say input old URL. So if that's the case, we can then say, let's just do this in single quotes, value is, and we concatenate on here, input old URL, and otherwise nothing. Now this might look a bit confusing. Let's just get rid of these brackets because they're not really required. We're checking if input old for URL, which means whatever's passed back, because we've given this with input, so that will pass all that back. So if any old input exists, let's put that back in there, and we'll also escape this as well, and otherwise nothing. So that's that. So now what should happen is, if we mistakenly put a wrong URL in here, it will warn us. But what we want to do is, I'm going to inspect this and change the type back to text. That'll make that a little shorter because we validated, CSS selected that. But let's shorten this, and it says the URL format is invalid, which is perfectly true. And it also puts the old input back in there for us. So we've done that, we know that that works. Let's go ahead and focus on other things. So echo OK otherwise. Let's test this out. And there we are, so we get OK. So we know that this is working now. So if everything is OK, we want to start to generate what we need. Let's store a couple of variables first though. The URL is going to be input get URL. This will obviously just be the URL, and we're going to set code to null because we're going to be generating or storing a value in this variable based on either whether it exists or when we generate a new code. So let's check now if a URL already exists in our table. So at the moment, if I select everything from links, there's nothing in there. So at the moment, any URL that we enter will not exist, but we use the link model. Remember the thing we created here? This now has eloquent functionality, so we can do things like where URL equals URL, which is obviously this here. Now database escaping will all take place here. That's why we don't need to sanitize anything here. So now we want to check if it does exist. So we say if exists count, which is the count of records based on this query here, is 1, this exists, otherwise does not exist. So let's create a record after we just do this. So let's type in shorten, does not exist. We know that that doesn't exist. But now let's insert into links, URL code, and we'll insert, and we'll just put the code as Google 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's inserted that. So we've now, if we select everything from links, we've got a record in here with the code as Google 123 and the URL is google.co.uk. So if we put this into here now, that exists. So in the case that a particular record exists, all we need to do is set the code to the exists that we've got here. Then we need to access the first element. In this case, it'll only be 1 because we're only ever storing 1 instance of a URL, and we want to get the code from that. So now code, if we echo this and we paste in that same URL, will bring back the code. So we can just pass that on to the user. We don't need to generate a new code now. Now, otherwise, we actually do need to generate a new code. So this is slightly more complicated. Now, the steps that we take to do this are we create a record first with no code. Then, if that was successful, we want to base convert the ID from base 10 to base 36, so lowercase and numbers, 0 to 9. And we then want to update that record with this new code. So we're doing two queries here, but it doesn't, well, we're doing 3 queries in total. We're checking, then creating, but this probably isn't the best way to do things. You could probably generate a really cool code, a unique code from something, but for now, this it will do. You'll end up with, on your first record, you'll end up with a unique code as 1, and when you get to sort of record 100 million, then you'll start to get more interesting short URLs. But at the end of the day, this is a short URL generator. We want to generate short URLs. We're doing this. So let's go ahead and do this. So created, we're going to store a variable here so we can check it worked. We're going to use the link model again and the create method that Eloquent gives us. And in here, we're going to pass an array in with the fields that we want to populate. In this case, it's just URL, and we know the URL. What we can now do is check if that created value worked. So if this actually creates it, then that's cool. We can generate a code. And like I said, we use base convert here. Now this allows us to enter a specific number, so 1, 2, 3, all the way up to whatever, the base from and the base to. So the base from is 10, and the base to is going to just be 36. So where do we get this number from? Well, we want to get the ID of the created record. So created ID. It's as simple as that. Now that we've got the code, we want to update the record that we created up here with this new code. Because at the moment, what's going to happen is it's going to create the record with no code. Then it will create a code, but it won't do anything. We need to update this. So we're going to say updated is link. In fact, we don't actually need to do updated. We can just say link. Where. So we're going to do a where clause here. We're going to say where ID is equal to the newly created ID as we used here. So we want to update the contents of this, passing an array in to tell us what we want to update. In this case, it's the code, and we want to set that to the code variable we generated here. Now, the reason we created this code null up here is this has set this code value. This has set this code value. So if there is no code, then we want to not do anything. So we only want down here, remember this is outside of the if here, we want to say if code, then redirect home. Now that's going to be with a message saying, this worked, here's your link. But if not, we want to define the default behavior down here. So we want to redirect to home with a global message saying this went wrong. Something went wrong. Try again. So let's test this out, but we'll fill in this redirection first. So let's return a redirect here. And we want to say to the user, this is done now. We've generated a code, whether it's by inserting and updating a record or retrieving an existing one. So we want to say redirect to home. And we want, we want this to be with global data. And if you're not sure what this global data is, basically what we're doing is passing a session here that we're going to pick up using session get. And we'll see this on the home in a minute. Once we've done these messages, we'll go back and we'll modify this page to output these global messages we're passing back through. So here we'll say all done. Here is your short URL. So we'll define an anchor here. And we want the href and the contents of this to be exactly the same. So we want these to be basically using the URL helper. We want to go through to the get page or the get route that we created, this passing in the code, because that's what we want to output to the user. And this means we don't have to start typing HTTP blah 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 ourselves. And if you switch domains, this will automatically keep updated. So in here, we want to concatenate on here URL to an action, and this action is get. Remember, we named our route get here for this get code thing, and we then subsequently pass in the code because we have a placeholder here for a variable in there. And we want to do the same for the actual contents of the link as well, the display for the link. So we do exactly the same thing here. We say URL action to the get route and there to the code. So that should pass that back through. But how do we pick up this global message? Well, this is really easy. Inside of home.blade.php, we want to say if, and we will end that if there. So we want to check for a session called global, and if that does exist, we can create paragraph tags and then output this to the user. So in this case, it's session get. So we're using has to check if it exists, and we're saying get to get it, and this is called global. So let's just run through this if we're a little bit confused. We know that we're validating stuff. Otherwise, what we're doing, we're checking if the URL exists in the database. If it does, we're just returning the code or setting the code to that code, which we'll later deal with here. Otherwise, we are creating a blank record or a record with just the URL. Then if that works, we're generating a code using base convert to convert this to a different base. Then we are updating the record we just created with this generated code. If either methods work, we're going to redirect global with the link. This will now be in the database. And otherwise, if something unexpected happens, we're just going to say something went wrong, try again. So let's just check this out, make sure we've made no mistakes along the way. So over to the public directory, let's enter google.co.uk. Now remember, this already exists here. So what we should get is we should receive a URL back with this code inside of that generated URL. So we click shorten and it works. So here's your short URL. There it is with Google 123. Let's enter a URL now that doesn't exist here. So we say codecourse.com and click shorten. There we go. So this is the base convert taking action where you see here we've got 2. If we look in the database, you can see that we've got 2 for the ID. Therefore, base 10 converted to base 36 for 2 is just 2. Now, I'm not saying this is the correct way to do things, but if you do want to change this so it does generate slightly longer URLs, you can alter your table. So we say alter table links, and we want to change the auto increment to a larger number. I'm going to change this to 100 million or a billion, whatever. So now when I generate a URL, this time we'll go for google.com, we get a slightly longer, more still unique value here. So like I've said, there are probably better ways to generate these longer URLs, but this way for now will certainly do. So we've got an ID of 100 million and this code, which is the base converted from 10 to 36. So now that we've done this, the only thing left to do is clicking on this should take us through to google.com. In this case, it doesn't. So we need to define the other, link. We need to define the other method, get. So we pass a code through into here. So let's test this out by echoing code. When I refresh, this says 1n whatever. So we know that this is replicating this. So quite simply, what we really need to do is look this up in our database. Now, if we look this up in our database and it exists, we can grab the URL and we can redirect that user to the URL. So we need to create a variable here called link. And this will be link where, remember we use the where clause, we're using Eloquent, where code is equal to the code that's been passed in. So now we can create an if statement to say if link count, and we can even check that against 1. We want to return a redirect to, we're using 2 now because we're not doing this to an action inside our application. This is an actual URL. And we can say link, we use the first method to get the first record. In this case, there's only 1 anyway. And we grab the URL from that. So we're basically redirecting to a URL. Now, if that's not the case, let's put a fallback down here. We want to redirect to home. So we say redirect action home. So let's test this out. So when I go back and I click on, in fact, let's run this whole through thing again. So we'll say www.google.co.uk. That's got this unique identifier here. When I click it, that just takes us through to Google. Straightforward. And that's pretty much it. So we've looked at the ability to enter a URL. We've looked at validation, generating this, storing it inside of our database, making sure that we're not storing too many records. We're only storing 1 record for each URL. We're defining it a unique identifier based on the ID inside of the database, and then we are redirecting a user to that once it's been copied and pasted wherever to anyone needing to access that URL. And that is basically it. We've created a URL shortener with Laravel.